Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock on Friday, the 11th of April, 2025. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Charles Malet, and joining me in the studio today is Patrick Henningsen. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Charles.
And by video link, Mark Anderson from the United States. Now, we will have a full programme today, and we'll be covering the push for war with Iran, as well as farmers' protests, and indeed the latest on the pandemic treaty. But we will start with tariffs. Now, as Keir Starmer tweets about Passover and Rachel Reeves sends out messages about Doncaster Airport, there is a rather bigger economic picture taking shape, and Mark's going to take the lead for us today on that. Over to you, Mark.
Good day, everyone. After last week's spirited discussion on tariffs, naturally, since I've covered Congress a lot of years, I had to look to Congress. And as we'll see here, on the very day, April 2nd, that President Trump gave his Rose Garden speech about emphasizing tariffs, a declaration of economic independence, that very day, there was a vote in the Senate, and The Hill reported on it. 4 Republican senators vote with Democrats to undo Trump tariffs on Canada. The thing is, as is often the case with the media cartel, their headlines don't always match the stories, because as I noted on this slide, what it actually said in the body of the story is that in a 51-48 vote, the Senate expressed its sense that it will disagree with Trump's tariffs on Canada, but the vote was on a resolution that does not have the force of law and is just symbolic. Now, of course, I didn't stop looking there. The Senator Charles Grassley, a very noted veteran senator from Iowa, the very next day, April 3rd, they issued a press release, he and Maria Cantwell out of Washington State. And as I expected, Congress is trying to throw its weight around and regain its constitutional authority on trade. And indeed, as it states here, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution delegates to Congress the power, quote, to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the states, so that's internal and external, and with the Indian tribes. So Senators Grassley and Maria Cantwell have introduced legislation, quote, to restore Congress's constitutionally authorized role in setting and approving U.S. trade policy according to their joint news release. Now, a quick footnote here is that Congress has long had this power, and as is the case with the border, Congress is often making new laws when they don't have to. They have existing constitutional authority and existing laws in most cases, and they simply need to enforce or assert those things. And instead, they spend a lot of time burning up a lot of time carrying out onerous and often tedious legislation. That being said, Chuck Grassley had this to say around the time of that press release: for too long, Congress has delegated its clear authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce to the executive branch. Building on my previous efforts as Finance Committee Chairman, I'm joining Senator Cantwell to introduce this bipartisan Trade Review Act of 2025. That's the actual name of the bill, to reassert Congress's constitutional role. That's a U.S. Senate photo. Pretty much everything I'm reporting today is firsthand and has not been in the regular news feed, except for that Hill item. Anyway, here's the basic thrust of that bill, and we'll be keeping an eye on it to see if it passes. To enact a new tariff, the president must notify Congress of the imposition of a new or the increase of an existing tariff within 48 hours and explain his reasoning. The president also must provide an analysis of the potential impact on American businesses and consumers of these tariffs. Within 60 days, Congress must pass a joint resolution of approval on the new tariff. Otherwise, all new tariffs on imports expire after that deadline. And the fourth main plank here is Congress could end tariffs at any time by passing a disapproval resolution, although anti-dumping measures would get special consideration, such as when China over the decades has occasionally dumped hardwoods, lithium batteries, toys, steel, chemicals, things like that. There might be exceptions there. Moving forward, of course, the oldest committee in the U.S. Congress is the Ways and Means Committee, created in July of 1789, and they still exist. Who knew, right? Anyway, the full committee hearing on the Trump administration's 2025 trade policy agenda was held this past Wednesday. I covered it virtually online, and I only used the Ways and Committee's own broadcast, not any other news broadcast. And the only witness, the only one to testify, was U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Jamieson Greer. I believe that's Jamieson Greer. At any rate, the meeting went on, and it had your typical bipartisan split in it, as this next slide kind of illustrates. The party number one was mainly represented by Chairman Jason Smith of Missouri, the Republican, and party number two, door number two, ranking member Richard Neal, a Democrat out of Massachusetts. And they had your typical binary arguments, your typical Republican arguments, your typical Democrat arguments. And a quick observation there is that the absence of independent parties or non-affiliated candidates or non-affiliated members of Congress, that is very, very clear when it comes to these rather divisive issues, because you never get anybody refereeing what's going on. It's just your typical Democrat, typical Republican. If you had a Jim Traficant, at least someone independently minded, even though he was a Democrat, or you had actual numerous third-party candidates elected to office, you could get more nuance, you could get more objectivity, but you often don't get that with the media only focusing on your typical Democrat-Republican arguments. But anyway, we have some two quick video clips that are pretty far apart from one another, but it gives the range of views that were talked about from the Democrat side and the Republican side. So let's see those video clips.
Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to show a slide to everybody documenting where we are with the United States and the U.S. trade deficit. I think this really shows why this is an emergency. If you look at where we are with manufacturing goods, that's in the red column here. If you look at what has happened to the manufacturing capacity of the United States, we have plummeted, absolutely plummeted down. Here in 2022, we have such a trade deficit with manufactured goods. This is critical. This is why the president has said this is an emergency. The same thing with fuels and other total goods. We have plummeted in this nation's capacity to actually produce things. So yes, this is an emergency, and this is by all means altogether the right thing to do. If we do not reverse this trend, again, going with the absolute calamitous effect of how we are hurtling towards a sovereign debt crisis, this nation does not exist. And yes, there is short-term problems, without a doubt, but it's the same thing by taking medicine you don't want to take. If we don't help the body by intervening and doing what is critically important for this nation, nothing else matters. So this is why how manufacturing has plummeted, and this is why we are in a state of emergency. Thank you.
Quick footnote, that's Representative Greg Murphy out of North Carolina, Republican. A quick footnote is I contacted his office and I tried to get that graphic so we could get a closer, clearer look at it, and I did not get a response yet. Anyway, we have a Representative Chu, CHU, out of California, a Democrat, giving the opposing view, and that's the next video.
They are barely able to afford their everyday living expenses, but now they're hearing that the average family will have to pay $4,600 a year more because of the Trump tariffs. They are hearing this will be the largest tax increase for the American people in our nation's peacetime history. They are hearing Goldman Sachs say that we face a recession. The increases will be for food items that the U.S. does not produce domestically, like cacao beans, coffee beans, tea and spices, and certain nuts. But non-food items like clothing, consumer electronics, shoes, cell phones, furniture, and household appliances will be especially hard hit, as more than 50% of our consumption comes from countries facing tariff increases of 30% or more. I must point out that there are some items on the list like bananas and cacao beans, which the U.S. can never grow enough of to meet our own demand because of our mostly non-tropical climate. In fact, the U.S. produces a tiny number of bananas in Hawaii and Florida, but depends enormously on importing bananas from Guatemala, Ecuador, and Costa Rica, all of which receive tariffs. And in fact, the U.S. is the world's largest importer of bananas. So this shoot first, then aim approach is making Americans' lives much worse with no actual plan and doesn't make any sense.
So that's the opposing view on that. Interesting stuff. Now, an interesting twist, and she alluded to food, is that we need to make a distinction between perishable and non-perishable goods. In fact, it might make sense for the U.S. to be striving for self-sufficiency more in the food area than durable goods because food can spoil or become contaminated. There's only so much shelf life, and your supply chains might have to be dealt with differently. Now, we have a miscellaneous item here. The shrimping industry in the U.S., however, is cheering the proposed legislation and cheering the Trump tariffs. They like what they see. And this is out of myrgv.com. It happens to concern the port of Brownsville, where they harvest enormous amounts of shrimp about an hour east of where I'm sitting. And there's another bill in Congress, as this alludes to, House Resolution 2071, the Save Our Shrimpers Act, has been introduced there to prohibit federal funding from going to international financial firms that finance foreign shrimp farms. The Rio Grande Valley, that's deep South Texas, the shrimp industry here, and the rest of the domestic industry, hopes that resolution becomes law. Quote, in light of the fact that U.S. shrimpers have been brought to their knees by unrelenting waves of cheap foreign exports flooding the market and driving prices down past the point of sustainability. And we have one more item on this. It's a hard thing to police, we're hearing. The U.S. International Trade Commission found last year that imported farm-raised shrimp is ultra cheap because, quote, other countries are subsidizing their fisheries and dumping their product on the U.S. market, end quote, according to that trade commission. So that's it for now, gentlemen. I have a little bit later on state-level trade that adds another interesting twist to this that no one ever thinks about. But now over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And supply chains will be something we'll come back to presently, but obviously this is a very big topic, so we're going to extend this theme. So Patrick's going to continue with the tariff story.
Well, the previous congressional speaker there, she said they don't grow much bananas in America, but there's plenty of bananas in Washington, as we will show you shortly. This whole story has just completely exploded here. We'll look at this up on screen. Now, I tweeted this on Monday, April of 7th here, and I predicted that Trump would get pressure from the donor class and that he would then suspend the tariffs that he put on across the board to the entire world. And looks like that's exactly what happened. And I even quoted him almost verbatim on Monday. I predicted what Donald was going to say. We're postponing the implementation of the tariffs because, quite frankly, what we've done is so great. Just the announcement has already had such a great impact in governments and now begging us for a deal. That's what I predicted Donald would say, and it's true. So here we are. This is the result. This is a bottle. This reminds us of, you could say, Kevin Keegan's England team. But anyway, it looks like Trump has bottled it. The pressure came, and he did cave. Trump announces a 90-day pause on the tariff war, except for China, except for one country. So that's interesting. Now, this is where things are going to get a little bit dicey for the Trump administration. Let's take a look. There's Donald there. I guess he's claiming victory, Charles, but it seems to be anything but, because this has started a tit for tat with China that is now getting unbelievably ridiculous. Take a look at this. Consider these two are among each other's greatest trading partners. China has raised tariffs in reciprocation to what the U.S. has done. China raised tariffs on all U.S. goods up to 125% as the trade war ramps up. Now, that's in response to Trump putting on 40 or 50%. There's been so many changes in the last 48 hours, it's hard to keep track of it here. But Trump, not to be outdone, here he is. The White House says that a tariff rate on most Chinese imports will now be 145%. Where is this going to end? And, you know, the whole basis of this, and this is the strange thing, Trump has called this trade war on a national emergency. And one has to look at the predicate for this. One of them was a fentanyl crisis. Okay, some fentanyl coming over the Mexican border. They're blaming China for it. It's a bit tenuous, but they're saying that, and we'll bring the order up on screen here. This is what the White House published here. And then they're saying, no, this is a national emergency because of a trade deficit. But the thing is, how could it be an emergency when the United States has had a trade deficit since 1934? So it's taking them, over, I don't know, something like 80, 90 years to work out this so-called emergency here. So he's invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 in order to ram this emergency through. But globalization's been going since the 90s. Pretty much full steam. So it's not as if this was a surprise, but nonetheless, they're carrying on with this right now. Let's take a look here. There's the Donald. And so this is what the line is here. You probably heard this. Everyone's heard this. They're ripping us off. They're ripping us off. We're getting a terrible deal. Donald's been saying this actually since before he became president here. But are they really ripping the U.S. off? Let's take a look at the facts. No, actually, in actuality, the U.S. is ripping everybody else off by exporting their fiat dollars in exchange for actual valuable goods. This is the advantage the U.S. has had because they have the world reserve currency. This allows the U.S. to deficit spend by the tune over $2 trillion per year. And with that $2 trillion, they're able to fund their military-industrial complex. They're able to project power globally, power and influence globally, effectively run a global empire on the U.S. dollar system. The U.S. has been running a trade deficit since 1934, fact. And the deficit is roughly the amount of government spending versus how much they produce. So there's a deficit there. It's almost mathematical as an equation. The U.S. deficit is not caused by other countries ripping off America. It's caused because the United States has gone through the process of offshoring its manufacturing. It used to be an industrial power, but now it's a financial power. It's to financialize its economy. Guess who's an industrial power? China. China's doing what the United States did back in 1890, and that's the golden years that Trump and his team keep hearkening back to. So this conversation, just the more you look at it, it just doesn't add up. And we go on. Exporting dollars in exchange for debt props up the U.S. dollar as a world reserve currency, as we said earlier. And here's the key point. This is essentially a corrupt system which allows the U.S. to pay for all of these wars on its national credit card. This is what it comes down to. It's not about other countries ripping off the president here. And, when Trump, and this is the, so tariff fallacies, this is the tariff chart. This is the calculations on this was totally arbitrary and completely bogus. He's been panned by the pundits for this year. He's even getting panned by the financial press on this. Fortune. Some of these are generally pro-conservative, pro-Trump publications here. Trump's tariff formula used the wrong value in its calculations, conservative think tank says. This whole thing was rigged. They're talking about this entire tariff farrago. The formula the White House used to calculate its recent tariffs is based on an error that roughly quadrupled the rates from what they should have been. So, this is a serious problem here when we're talking about competency of the Trump administration. He's the businessman. He's known as the billionaire, the money maker, the deal maker. How could he get the economics and the numbers so horribly wrong? And we'll continue here. More tariff fallacies. There he is again. He's still angry. He's saying, we'll correct the deficit with money raised from tariffs. That's the claim the Trump administration's making. But actually, punitive tariffs de-incentivizes trade with the U.S., meaning less revenue. A recession is coming now because of a lack of confidence. Inflation is moving in, meaning less affordability and demand, and no immediate, quote, cheap U.S.-made goods to replace the expensive imports. We're looking at 5 to 10 years away from the United States becoming reindustrialized, even if they had all of their eggs and their ducks in a row on that score. So second fallacy, it worked in 1890 when the U.S. had tariffs and no income tax. This is the basis of the whole gambit here from the Trump administration, at least the public-facing pitch. 1890, the U.S., again, as I said, had an industrial economy, and the U.S. ran massive trade surpluses back then. This is why their foreign policy became more aggressive, because they needed markets at that time for their products. So they were having a de-inflationary period, and they needed to expand. That was the beginning of the U.S. empire. 2025, however, we have a financialized economy, and the U.S. is off offshored its manufacturing, mostly for the better part of 30 years, but actually in reality, even before that. Okay, now for some trade tariff realities here. And some realities, let's just lay it on the table. Tariffs have further triggered inflation. Fact. Recession, stagflation, collapse in the bond market. Arguably, this is where the pressure came onto Trump from some of his billionaires who have all of their money in long plays on the stock market. The stock markets have taken a beating, not just in the U.S., but internationally here. A rise in the cost of living. That means lower living standards. Wiping out gains from trade. So buying cheaper imports, selling advantaged goods, that's the normal gains from trade that the U.S. would normally have in this very delicate balance of a global trading system. Trump is just basically taking a wrecking ball to this in the course of a week or two. Unbelievable and unprecedented here. Fewer U.S. goods means more expensive at home, as well more expensive to export. So no significant trade in the trade balance. This is what the experts are saying. There's not going to be a big difference in the trade deficit. The result is going to be less trade both coming in and going out. So this is a contraction of the economy. This is what Trump has done by disrupting the economy. And this is why a lot of people are really going crazy in the analytical world here. Stock market crashes, trillions have been wiped out on market cap. And here's the main point: further wrecking the U.S. economy, wrecking the world trading system. It might not be ideal for the United States, but the United States didn't have goods to export. And that is not the fault of China or anybody else in the world. What they're trying to do is punish everybody else for their problems. And this is not going to go down well for future relationships here. And we'll just move forward and see. Okay, and this is a good point here. And we'll bring this next up on stage. Americans need a little history lesson, and I'm sure even the British know this. The Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773. No taxation without representation. Mark Henningsen did a great job in showing the issue of the Congressional authority. Trump, as one man, is trying to basically levy taxes effectively here, but really also messing with the entire global trade system here. So this is a drawing made by a 5th grade student. So I would direct the Trump economic team to this 5th grade student just to remind themselves, and we bring an irony alert in here, Charles, that the Boston Tea Party originally was to bail out the British East India Company. Parliament wanted to maintain that ability to tax the colonies, but it was really about bailing out the corporations on that. They had a huge balance of payments problems with the British government at the time, but this is another key issue. European markets were very weak at the time due to debts from the French and Indian wars, among other wars at the time. Does this sound familiar? It certainly does. And so you have all these monopolies back in the day, back in the late 1700s, and it created a situation, and that was only a 2% tax, Charles, and it was enough for the colonists to rebel. And look at what they're throwing now on imports and exports, these tariff wars. It dwarfs even what was going on back then. So we can learn a little bit from history, and again, note the irony alert. So a lot of Trump fans are saying this is just 3D chess. He's escalating to de-escalate, right? Or 6 million D chess, as it's now being called. Escalate to de-escalate. But is it really, or do they actually know what they're doing? And, to be very critical here, and we'll show you a video clip in a second, every millionaire I've spoken to or who I follow has made an absolute killing in the last week. They have put short positions down. They made tons of money. Working folks I know have had their retirement savings slashed by 20 to 30%. It's been an absolute rout, again, for the middle class, and it's surely not going to be good for the working class. And Donald Trump is the man of the people. He breached Boris breached the Red Wall. Donald Trump captured the Rust Belt and got all those blue dog Reagan Democrats back. So listen to this. This is from the White House just, I believe, yesterday. This is Trump with the famous Charles Schwab of Charles Schwab brokerage fame here, and they're boasting about how much money that they made in the last week. Watch this.
This is Charles Schwab. It's not just a company, it's actually an individual. And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million. That's not bad, because, he's in financials. I've always been following.
So there it is. I mean, right straight from the horse's mouth. They absolutely rinsed it, these guys. I mean, it's kind of like insider trading, but on a galactic scale. And he was even tweeting out things like, whoever runs his Twitter account, now is a good time to buy, when the stock market was at its absolute low. So this is like dog whistles to Wall Street. Plus, there was a ticker symbol for one of the Trump businesses as well that went out on another Trump account. I mean, it's kind of a free-for-all. So anyway, let's look at the wrap-up on this here. We'll bring this up on stage right now. Trump's real agenda. Okay, the golden age of America. He wants to bring us back to McKinley's 1890. Let's look at the reality. This is the real agenda. Trump is trying to force down the value of the U.S. dollar in order to refinance $9 trillion in U.S. debt. Okay, that's the number one priority. And they're not really articulating that to the public very clearly, and that's part of the problem. That's actually the core. So the world has to suffer for U.S. domestic fiduciary responsibility issues, right? So increase external revenue, claims Trump, in order to pay for massive tax cuts, probably for the rich, like in 2017. So a loss of internal revenue and totaling $4 trillion over the next 10 years. So that massive tax cut, is that really going to get paid for with the tariff and trade balance? It doesn't look like it will. It's debatable. The signals don't look good right now. Anyway, massive deregulation, massive privatization, and so incentivizing direct investment. But this is a problem. This is also why the cost of living is so high. This is why China has the edge. They have state-run utilities. They're able to control and subsidize the cost of energy. This is why they're an industrial powerhouse, because they have a hybrid, mixed economy, just like the United States did back in the late 1800s. And again, Trump and his team need a history lesson. They seem to be cherry picking American history here, but not to be outdone here, allowing for wild levels of Washington insider trading. Listen, what we're showing you is just the tip of that iceberg. And then here, bypassing Congress, as Mark pointed out, that key issue earlier, the power of the purse on living tax. This is a huge problem. It's really putting the power into the hands of one man. So this is ultimately weakening Congress with one-person rule. This is an autocracy. Fair question. Main point, zero-sum policy, trying to control who trades with who, etc., like with Russia, like with India and Russian oil. Nord Stream pipeline is a result of this zero-sum foreign policy here. And so what are we really looking at? And this is the big fear. Effectively, Trump is trying to sanction China through tariffs, to isolate China, to build an iron curtain like they've done with Russia economically. How did that work out with Russia? Russia's got projecting 3% growth. Europe's projecting 0% growth. So Russia's beat this system, outperformed the U.S. and Europe, and China arguably is set to do the same, Charles. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the main takeaway here. This is hard foreign policy done through economic policy, and I don't know if this is going to end well for Trump.
Well, we shall see. It's certainly gone very well for the billionaire class who have made money at every turn. And as we see consistently, you invoke the emergency and then you watch the money roll in. So that there is some capital to be made. But of course, the idea that Trump is standing tough against China is something that can be sold to a certain extent. I wonder also about the, if we're moving a few steps closer to central bank digital currency with a accelerating of the collapse, but more to talk about in extra, certainly. Now, with all this in mind, economic conditions are certainly unfavourable for farmers in the United Kingdom, and there's been a lot out on social media recently. I spoke on Wednesday about protests, a wheat strike. Now we've got Farmers to Action putting out a note saying that they are going to be saying no to Labour. Now, I urged a note of caution on Wednesday because I felt that there is a huge potential for a backfire effect as the government are very, very able to spin this sort of direction as being that the farmers are causing trouble and indeed that they're not entirely necessary. And of course, that was to do with the fact that a lot more wheat is being imported this year in any case. And just to illustrate the point I'm making, Farmers Weekly here advertising, or at least reporting, that Daniel Zeichner, the DEFRA minister, was blocked from getting out of a meeting in Tavistock. Now, I'm sure it didn't last very long, but it's very easy to see how that sort of thing could be spun in a particular way to make small landowners and small farmers seem less relevant than, of course, they really are. I think the central issue here is that continually going to government, who routinely and almost ritually abuse farmers and indeed the supermarkets, is very much barking up the wrong tree. Why on earth would they change their behaviour? What's in it for them? And just to illustrate the sort of lack of care in this regard, I should just point out the Groceries Code Adjudicator is the one-man band that is supposed to arbitrate over the relationship between producers and supermarkets. So consider that he is incredibly under-resourced, and also that the entirety of the DEFRA budget for this year is 2.4 billion, which would take the National Health Service only 5 days to dispose of. So the message really, insofar as UK Column is concerned, is absolutely to adopt what Julian Rose describes as the proximity principle. And this really should be an opportunity for farmers to be looking for markets elsewhere and dealing with people that are able to meet whatever type of shortfall. But obviously with all the enormous uncertainty concerning the tariffs and trade, this would seem a time that farmers really have an opportunity to be providing a degree of self-sufficiency that actually is not there at the moment, and to control parts of the market that are absolutely not tied down, shutting out supermarkets and indeed government in the process. So something we will definitely follow, but it remains to be seen how that story will be spun. Now, UK Column is funded exclusively by its members and viewers, and if you would like to take part in sustaining what it is that we do and enabling us to go further and better, then please do consider making a donation via the website or joining as a member on a monthly or annual or even lifetime basis, or you could go to the shop and pick up any amount of our very high quality merchandise there. Also, we do stock Clive de Carle's products there, which we get a little percentage from. So that's, again, another option. Please do share all of our content. It's critical in these days of censorship that does get pushed out by those that support UK Column, because we fall foul of all the various algorithmic issues. And now we go to the case of Dan Kleinman, who gave a very good interview to Diane Rasmussen McCaddy on fighting sexual grooming in libraries. And he's now looking for financial assistance in defending against 2 federal defamation lawsuits filed against him by a school librarian in Louisiana. So there'll be details of this in the show notes. Tomorrow in Glasgow, there's going to be the Stand for Peace Scotland Glasgow Peace Walk. So please do get along to that if you're able. Now, Stand in the Light, which was attended by UK Column last year, is going to be happening at the end of May, 23rd to the 26th, up in beautiful Cumbria. UK Column will be attending, and we will be having Darren and Fee on to talk about that in due course. So do consider coming up to see what's going on there. We've published the article which follows up the appearance of John Kiriakou on the news last week, and this is an article by Fiorella Isabel about the effectively censorship through frozen assets by banking. Also up on the UK Column website now is the Scottish People's COVID-19 inquiry. All the various videos are there. And then today, being live streamed from Cambridge, the Sense and Sensibility conference about the origins of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And among the speakers there are Major General Bakshi, who, of course, has been on a UK Column symposium, but also Brian, Lucy Morgan-Edwards and George Galloway. And I should remind you that if you haven't yet got access to the recording of our event in Cheltenham on Saturday, then you're absolutely missing a trick. So please do go to the website and get your access to the live stream there, which is very much still available. Yesterday, the second part of Brian's interview with Carl Schwartz went out. It follows the first excellent one about what was known leading up to the events of the 11th September 2001, and that was concerning sort of asbestos response felt in emergency responders. And part 2, which came out yesterday, is dealing with the aircraft that were reportedly involved in that day, but evidence substantiating the effects of a controlled demolition. Now, That takes us back to Mark, and really on a related theme, Mark, but the situation with trade in certain parts of the states.
A very interesting thing, gentlemen, about trade that's never discussed is that individual states, especially here Texas, have their own trade deals, their own trade policies, and even send trade delegations to other nations. This first slide is very illustrative of that. Of course, Texas and California are the ones, individual states with the longest coasts. California has the Long Beach and Los Angeles ports, where trade goes in and out. If you haven't seen those ports, they have to be seen to be believed. The massive amount of stuff that goes in and out of there. Texas is right behind them, especially out of Houston and Brownsville. Anyway, here this slide illustrates that the state of Texas has a Taiwan office, and Texas trades with nearly 220 foreign markets. It has a Japan office, and it trades mainly with Mexico, Canada, the Netherlands, China, and South Korea. And there's an interesting part as it shows here, Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, quote, "No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace," and then I emphasize the main part, "or enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with the foreign power." And that's without the consent of Congress. So the states are carrying out quasi-autonomous trade policies of their own. One has to wonder, and it talks about how that might harmonize and different trade policies going on now. And we have a couple other slides that will kind of drive this point home to try and figure out, or at least consider the issue of individual states having trade policies with regards to what Trump's doing at the federal level. If we could look at the next slide, that it shows a little bit more about this with regards to Michigan and California. Michigan has nearly 200 foreign markets, and its main trade partners are Canada, Mexico, China, Germany, and Japan. And California has over 225 foreign markets, its main trading partners being Mexico, Canada, China, Japan, and Taiwan. Now, by foreign markets, that doesn't mean just individual nations. It means regional organizations and different institutions that are involved, different players that are involved in the trade schematic. But the main point here, gentlemen, is that Michigan, California, Texas, and several other states, they send trade delegations to other countries. There's that constitutional measure that I just showed that says that they really ought not to do that without explicit congressional approval. And these are very massive trade deals that Texas, California, Michigan, and these other states have with these other nations. And I'm bringing this up mainly as an awareness thing. How much has the Trump administration and Congress, the U.S. Congress, which I talked about earlier today, how much have they considered this? And how much will the Trump policies collide with, or maybe harmonize with, or maybe be neutral regarding all these state trade efforts that are at least constitutionally questionable, especially having such large amounts of trade going on with individual states acting as if they're separate nations. So it's just an awareness thing. It's a constitutional thing. It's another piece in the puzzle to consider. I'll leave it at that for now, but it's a very interesting topic at that.
Mark, thanks very much. And I think we might have time to come back to that in extra. We now move back to the UK, where we are, in effect, hotting up the case for, I would say, potential war with Iran. News today put out by Defence Science and Technology Laboratories that they've had a critical advancement in the UK's defence capabilities. What you're actually looking at is a fake picture of a fake hypersonic missile that doesn't yet exist, but nonetheless, they're talking about it as though it does. They say that this might be ready by 2030, part of a joint UK-US project, and this gives them opportunity to hark back to what was happening last year, being put out by Defence Intelligence, where the suggestion was that there was an inextricable link between what was going on in Russia, Ukraine, and indeed Iran's support of it. So this is a shaping operation, certainly in people's minds, to sow the idea that state threat from Russia is absolutely synonymous with state threat from Iran, and therefore that something has to be done about it. And we see that the British Forces Broadcasting Service here via its Forces News is, again, pumping up exactly the same story about this hypersonic, what's being called a successful test. But of course, it's still 5 years away from being a reality. And I think interesting to note that they conclude the article by saying Brazil, China, France, Iran, North Korea and Japan are among other countries with plans or programs devoted to hypersonic weapons. Of course, what they completely fail to mention is that since 2018, via its Gill system, Russia has had a hypersonic capability. And this is one of the things that is not to be talked about, because it clearly highlights the fact that the UK is not only well behind Russia, but supposedly it destroys the narrative that Russia is actually presenting a state threat, because if it really were, as I've asked before, why on earth would it not be doing rather more than it is as we sit there and supposedly build up our various arsenals? So a question to be asked there, but obviously the authorities not to be deterred insofar as the building of a narrative and indeed the intelligence that's supposed to support that goes. And we look at the country policy and information note on the government's website on Iran. Now, this says November 2022, but this is actually the most recent document. And rather remarkably, it refers back to statistics on military capabilities that are, first of all, not put together by this country. They're American statistics, and they go back to 2019. And that is the information upon which we are supposed to be deciding what relationship Iran has with the United Kingdom in terms of a state threat. Now, I've shown this slide before, but this is Hamish Falconer, Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, and he has stated that it is regrettably true that Iran's nuclear program has never been more advanced, and it threatens international peace and security. And this has been bandied around absolutely up and down the place. There's been debates on this in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but there is not one shred of evidence with which they can substantiate this. So I think it bears a lot more scrutiny. But we'll just go to look at the former ambassador for Iran, 2002-2006, Richard Dalton, who spoke on Newsnight recently, and this is what he had to say.
How seriously do you take this from President Trump?
I do take it seriously. The risk of a war between Israel and the United States on the one hand and Iran on the other has never been higher. And that's because it's been Israel's aim for many years to strike Iran, and they've always wanted to attract the United States to their side to do it because of limitations in Israel's capabilities, particularly in sustaining a long war. This is chiefly about weakening Iran as a state. Iran, and of course President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu knows this, does not have a nuclear weapon and does not have a military nuclear program. And that has been the consensus of US intelligence agencies in the US national intelligence estimates for the last 22 years. So let us hope that on this occasion, the Americans adopt a more reasonable position than has been sketched out for Iran hitherto.
Some hope, I think we might say. But nonetheless, he is quite right to point out that there is no intelligence to support this position. And yet politicians bandy it around absolutely willy-nilly, never with any comeback on this. And it is therefore pertinent and coincident that a carrier strike group is about to depart Portsmouth towards the end of this month to go towards the Mediterranean and then on to the Indo-Pacific. And we'll just listen to what Luke Pollard, Armed Forces Minister, has to say about this and why it's happening.
From the bridge of our flagship, HMS Prince of Wales, I'm proud to announce that our carrier strike group, made up of key naval, air and land forces from Britain and our allies, will depart from Portsmouth at the end of the month on its 2025 global deployment. Codenamed Operation HIGHMAST, it will engage with more than 30 countries, stretching from Italy to Japan and from South Korea to Australia. This isn't just any mission. With nearly 4,000 British personnel, accompanied throughout by a Norwegian frigate and auxiliary ship, we're leading a multinational task force of 13 nations, in a demonstration of integrated deterrence across the globe. For periods, the Carrier Strike Group will come under NATO command, strengthening the bedrock alliance of our national security. Naval power remains vital to upholding the international rules-based system that underpins our security and prosperity. Through Operation HIGHMAST, we stand firm with our allies against those who challenge the international order, reminding the world that threats in one region affect every region, that the security of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific are fundamentally indivisible.
Fundamentally indivisible, I think, are the words to concentrate on there, because soon it appears that the state threat from Iran will be fundamentally indivisible from that posed by Russia, and that seems to be the messaging that's going on here. There's a couple of other points to draw out of that. It's being referred to as Operation HIGHMAST and not exercise. Therefore, there is a suggestion there inherent that there is a specific potential for kinetic action. And of course, interestingly, they're defying the naming convention there. An operational name should never have anything to do with the operation itself, but naming it HIGHMAST would seem to be in breach of that. Also, of course, initially it's going to be under the command of the NATO exercise, which means that should the Carrier Strike Group be engaged at that point, that would of course trigger Article 5 and a response from all NATO members. So I think that's something that absolutely people should be bearing in mind. It's also said to have a cargo of, or at least capability of, up to 24 F-35 fighters. And if you've listened to Tim Davis, the former fast jet trainer and pilot with the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, talk about the F-35 capability against Russian air defense, then you would know that having 24 F-35s on board is not much to write home about. But this really, as I say, suggests that there is that linkage between what we're told about Russia and indeed what we're to be told about Iran. So it's a very clear sort of telegraphing of intent, at least what people are supposed to believe.
Well, as you know, Article 5 is not an automatic reflex, especially if you happen to be out of area. So it seems like the British Navy having difficulty fielding more warships than they have admirals at the moment. It's a bit of a casus belli, or bait, as it were. And so that's a little bit worrying when you think about it strategically, militarily. I can't see how they could make a big impact in any conflict versus the adversaries, which they are claiming to be opposing there. But just quickly, on the Iran issue here, I'll bring this up on screen. Charles, if the United States attacks Iran, that's just a little summary there. It's a couple years old, but 2024, I think, U.S. bases and troops deployment in the immediate vicinity of Iran. So all those would be targeted in a matter of minutes. So this is a huge number of target lists. That doesn't include Israel as well as Cyprus, which may or may not be included in that if they believe that that's where the origins. Even Oman and Saudi Arabia are on that list because they've got U.S. bases there, not to say anything about the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain or Kuwait, and Iraq for that matter. So, you know, there will be a blowback or a price to pay for the U.S. And I might add, too, Charles, that what the Trump administration are proposing for Iran, that they basically dismantle, or that the U.S. is allowed to destroy Iran's civilian nuclear program and eliminate all of their missiles. So the demilitarization of Iran, and if they don't comply, the U.S. will launch a preemptive tactical nuclear strike and a decapitation operation, as it were, to take out the leadership. So it's regime change, destroying the country, and so forth. These aren't negotiations, and I want to warn people just a little lesson of history. Shades of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire imposed huge, stringent demands on Serbia at the time, by which Serbia complied with all but one of those, and they still, Austro-Hungarians still declared war on Serbia. So that's what's happening here. The United States has issued a declaration of war. It's only a question of when they're going to attack. These are not negotiations, and this can't be seen as any kind of acceptable statecraft unless you're talking about the rules-based international order where he who has the power and the money makes the rules. And unfortunately, I believe that's where we are right now. So something to to think about there. But just note that Benjamin Netanyahu was in Washington this week, and there he is with Donald Trump, looking at pictures of Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. So some people who like to talk about narcissists and power-hungry oligarchs would get a chuckle at a photo like that. But last time Bibi was in Washington, it looked like they were plotting to cancel the ceasefire in Gaza. That's what eventually happened. Now we have a full-blown resumption of that conflict and the carnage there. What exactly were they planning on this trip to Washington? And it could very well be a joint strike on Iran. At that point, all bets are off, Charles.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, more to talk about in extra, but on the theme of things that won't go away, we're back to Mark with the pandemic treaty.
Thank you. I'm continuing, of course, to follow this very closely. The intergovernmental negotiating body that's working on the treaty, the talks resumed this past Monday, and they conclude today, April 11th. But I confirmed pretty much, it appears that the withdrawal of the U.S. from the WHO system literally meant that no U.S. participation was seen for the first time ever. There were no delegates this past week, concluding today, from the U.S. at the pandemic talks. And we're keeping in mind that the 78th World Health Assembly, the 19th through the 27th of May, is coming up. Now, it's also fairly clear. I talked to James Roguski briefly last night and looked through a whole bunch of WHO literature from about a year ago and recently. And I'm saying here with this slide, I'm saying stay tuned. And I took this photo during the deliberations, like my congressional report and the Ways and Means Committee. I took those online photos virtually to get us as much firsthand stuff as possible. I took this photo here. There's Tedros, the Director General, and a couple other top officials. And what I was able to distill out of this, I watched some of the dry, tedious deliberations. I'll tell you, it is a cure for insomnia. But the intergovernmental negotiating body, as of yesterday, was reportedly 80 nations shy of its needed consensus to finalize the treaty. But there are the talks today. And Roguski pointed out, and I saw other indications, that there might be additional pre-World Health Assembly talks that could be called, they could be organized to try and move things along. So Ding Dong, the witch is dead cannot be pronounced yet. She's still alive. We'll just have to keep a close eye on it. But the WHO funding cuts led by the U.S. That are troubling the WHO right now that I reported on last week, that is a bit of dead weight on the WHO, and it is creating some problems with them getting everything they want regarding the pandemic treaty. But we'll just keep a very close eye on this. It's a very critical time. The treaty has kind of been delayed and fallen on its face. Going about a year ago, May 2024, they were working on it, and it kind of got sidetracked and shelved for a while. So they're by no means having an easy time at this. And anything that we can do to contact members of parliament, local officials, members of Congress, depending on where you live, would be very important right now. And so we'll just keep a close eye on it and see if they have another negotiating meeting prior to the World Health Assembly, or if they wait for the World Health Assembly. That's the main question right now. So back to you guys.
Indeed. Mark, thank you very much indeed. And as you say, we need to keep our eye on it and where possible act, certainly at the local level, to push back on that. Now, other organisations that need to have an eye kept on them, number among them the BBC, of course, and they've just announced, or at least revealed, the fact that the statue on Broadcasting House by Eric Gill, which was damaged a couple of years ago, has been repaired, restored, and is now covered in a protective glass case. And now, the story here really is that Gill himself, a well-renowned sculptor of the 20th century, sculptor, was also a paedophile. And it's not to suggest that there should be any sense of revisionism to this. The building is, of course, a Grade 2 listed building, and therefore they're limited in terms of what they would be able to do, certainly without planning consent. But the point is this necessarily consistent, the BBC, insofar as the way they deal with other subject matter? So just look at the treatment of this. This is what the chief executive of Historic England, who's been sort of involved in the project, says, and he describes it as being in line with our approach of encouraging thoughtful, long-lasting and powerful reinterpretation of contested statues and sites, which keeps their physical context but adds new layers of meaning and understanding. Now, it's hard not to interpret that in light of the sorts of things that are going on in the education system with regard to what's being normalized to children in terms of sexuality and all kinds of sexual perversions. This would seem to add weight to that narrative. And as I say, the question to be asked here is the BBC being consistent, especially where other statue removals are concerned? And of course, this is how they reported on the removal of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol during the high point of the Black Lives Matter protest back in 2020. They described it as being a largely peaceful demonstration where, of course, actually quite a lot of people were injured. And then we've got their absolute failure to deal properly with people that have worked for them, such as Rolf Harris, Jimmy Savile, and, of course, most recently, Hugh Edwards. So I think the BBC at least can be accused of substantial hypocrisy, but also a certain degree of recklessness, because they point out in the article that they are not condoning the behaviour of Gill. They're trying to make a degree of separation between the man and the artwork, but therefore what they are certainly not doing is in any way condemning the behaviour, and also in putting a glass case round it, they are recognising that it remains vulnerable. And of course, inherent in that statement is the fact that they feel like they're doing something wrong. Now, I think we'll have more to say about that sort of thing in Extra. We're a bit pushed now, but we're now going to go into space.
Indeed. So this, of all the stories here, this is a feel-good story in a certain way. You might get a little bit of a smile out of this, but there he is. There he is. This is the little green man in Kiev. And what's going on here? Zelensky tries to arrest an International Space Station cosmonaut who is in space. And Zelensky seeking a 15-year jail term for this, quote, draft dodger. Believe it or not. So he did everything but serve him with papers up at the ISS here. So waited for him to get up into space before, this week they put that through in the Ukrainian judiciary there. Let's take a look at this here. And this astronaut here, this is Alexei Zubritsky there. And you can see he is the one there on your left-hand side, and he's there with another Russian cosmonaut and a U.S. astronaut, Johnny Kim. So he's up there, and so he's found himself in the crosshairs of Zelensky. Little did he know that the little green man had a beat on him from the moment he took off the Soyuz rocket from Kazakhstan. But there you are. So Zelensky, in his mission to find warm bodies for the trenches in Ukraine, here he is, always looking for conscripts these days. Zubrinsky was among the numerous Ukrainian military personnel who rejected the new government in Kiev, we're talking about 2014, and continued their careers in the Russian armed forces. So he's kind of a defector of sorts who was based in Sevastopol, so in Crimea. So he made that jump when the referendum happened in Crimea, as did many others. So he applied for the space program in 2017 and was confirmed as a flight engineer for the Soyuz MS-27 mission last August. And by Russian reports, he is among their most promising young astronaut candidates in years. So highly decorated here. And Zelensky basically put out an arrest warrant for him as a draft dodger. But that's interesting, Charles, that Zelensky would be chasing draft dodgers, because we only have to look at this interview here with none other than Piotr Poroshenko, who claimed that his successor, President Zelensky, was himself a draft dodger. And we have checked the background on this. It is true. In fact, Zelensky, we don't have the video with us, but there are videos on social media where he's kind of boasting that he's not going to be serving in the Ukrainian military while they were being trained by NATO at the time. This was after Maidan in 2014. So Zelensky, the draft dodger, is chasing astronauts that he claims are draft dodgers. I think that's just about the best thing I've read all week.
Absolutely. Once a comedian. Yes, I mean, one wonders where that story is going to go. Why on earth are we even to be made aware of it? It's extraordinary, but that is perhaps a suitable note upon which to draw the news to a close, but not before I remind you to make sure that you do go back to look at the part 2 of the Carl Schwartz interview with Brian from yesterday pertaining to the events of September the 11th back in 2001. And I think really significantly what was known before and in the immediate aftermath that has been so heavily suppressed. And also, again, a reminder really to catch up with what happened in Cheltenham at our UK column on location event, where, of course, Patrick spoke, among others. It was very, very well received, and I really would urge you to access the live stream if that's something you haven't already done. But otherwise, it just remains for me to thank Patrick very much indeed for joining me in the studio today. Thank you, Patrick, and to Mark for joining via video link, and we will look forward to seeing you again on the news on Monday. Thank you very much.
And extra.
Sorry, and extra, Patrick. Thank goodness you're here. Yes, for those of you that are members, please stay on the line and we'll be back in a few minutes for extra. Bye-bye.